Bienvenidos, buenos días. Ya vamos a empezar. Lorrie, I'll give a small interview in Spanish for everyone and then we'll start our interview in English. Bueno, bienvenidos a esta entrevista de Conectando Voluntades. Este es un espacio para resaltar los alcances y el potencial que tiene el voluntariado para el desarrollo de habilidades de las personas y de las comunidades. Hoy tenemos preparada una entrevista con Lorrie Foster. Este es un esfuerzo realizado entre PNUD, Empresas que Inspiran, Ikigai Laboratorio Social, Voluntare, Clave y Voluntarios ONU. Hoy conversaremos con Lorrie sobre el voluntariado corporativo en situaciones de crisis y desastres. La entrevista será realizada en inglés, pero luego podrán revisarla en YouTube con subtítulos. Todas sus preguntas son bienvenidas, las pueden hacer en inglés o en español, ya sea a través del chat o del Q&A. Nosotros nos ocuparemos de las traducciones en caso sean necesarias. Y les recordamos que todas las preguntas serán respondidas al finalizar. Lorrie Foster es directora de Estrategia Corporativa de IAVE, que es la Asociación Internacional Global de Voluntariado. Dentro de sus funciones facilita redes de líderes de empresas globales de gran escala, el Consejo Global de Voluntariado Corporativo y el Grupo de Investigación de Voluntariado Corporativo en Situaciones de Desastre. Diseña y dirige conferencias y foros sobre voluntariado corporativo. Actualmente, Lorrie está a cargo de gestionar la investigación global sobre el futuro del voluntariado en IAVE. Antes de unirse a IAVE, pasó varios años como ejecutiva en The Conference Board, un think tank global, y fue directora ejecutiva del World Trade Institute del World Trade Center en Nueva York. Lorrie cuenta con un máster en Administración Pública en el Harvard Kennedy School y estudios en Diplomacia y Asuntos Internacionales del Occidental College. Welcome, Lorrie, and thank you so much for being here with us. As you know, this interview is part of a large effort called Connecting Wills, or Conectando Voluntades in Spanish, between UNDP, Inspiring Companies, Ikigai Social Laboratory, UN Volunteers, Clave, and Voluntare. So thank you so much for being here with us today. So I want to start a conversation by asking, and based on your experience, considering what's happening in the world with COVID-19 right now, which puts us in one of the biggest global challenges of the 21st century, how do you think employee volunteering can catalyze a company's response to the crisis? What can volunteering do in cases like this?
First of all, Mariana, thank you for including me today in this important conversation, and buenos dias to all the participants. Actually, what we've seen at IAVE is there is a lot that companies can do right now in terms of volunteering. And we have seen volunteer managers being very, very creative. For example, some of our companies in Spain have been reaching out to the isolated elderly who have been quarantining themselves at home, as have many of us, but they are being especially careful. And their volunteers have been matching up with elderly persons in nursing homes and writing them letters that nurses are printing out, or sending them videos, or making regular phone calls, creating sort of a pen-pal relationship to make those people feel less isolated. Other companies have reached out to the disabled who are similarly very isolated. And one company, one large bank, had their volunteers doing online yoga with disabled individuals, which I thought was quite creative. Others have worked closely with their NGO partners and adapted their otherwise in-person volunteer programs to be virtual. For example, EDP in Portugal partners with Junior Achievement, and they usually get children interested in entrepreneurial pursuits. Instead, they made little videos and sent those to the children. For the high school aged secondary school children, they did some online back and forth discussions. So they took an existing program with an existing partner and made some changes. A number of our members also have done a lot of new virtual volunteering. They've signed up for things like Missing Maps, Translators Without Borders, the Citizen Science program, Zooniverse. They've also done some team volunteering. Some of the volunteer managers we've talked to were concerned about losing the team aspect of volunteering, but many of these platforms allow that as well. We also have seen one of our members, a US-based bank, said that they had senior executives who were never interested in volunteering before, but she was able to get them interested in this crisis time. And what they did is they reached out to their NGO partners and worked with their senior executive to coach them on financial issues. So the finance executives from the bank would work on financial issues. The business continuity people would work on business continuity plans, things that are critical for those NGOs at this time. And they got some great volunteering expertise. I would say that as horrible as COVID has been, it has also brought some creativity to volunteer managers and volunteer programs. And some are doing things that they never would have thought of before and that they may be continuing post-crisis.
Right. And something that you've mentioned speaks out to me, which is that usually, at least in Latin America here, we've seen that employee volunteering wasn't always related to the core business or the talents that an employee had. But now, because of these times, the managers have kind of been forced to think of innovative ways or creative ways, like you've mentioned. So for them to seek, okay, what are the talents in my company and how can they supply needs that are right now in everyone's, being emotional ones or entertainment or anything that can actually help a person's well-being. So that's very interesting. Is there an interesting or a case in disaster-related corporate volunteering, a specific one that maybe you could tell us about that you know of?
Well, we have at IAVE a working group on disaster volunteering. So we have a number of companies who have decided to focus on the full cycle of disaster, preparedness, response, and recovery, and to see what they can do with volunteers. And as you point out, it's important to look at what assets the company has in terms of physical assets, in terms of employee skills, where they're located in the world. So one of our members does quite a great job, and that's the UPS Foundation. And they have planes, and they have employees skilled in logistics, and they have created a team of 72 volunteers who are on a standby basis, ready to drop everything and go with the World Food Program around the world and deliver food where it's needed. So the UPS employees use their logistics skills to manage and organize the airport, and then to deliver and disperse food. I mean, they do several other things, but that's one good example. I would also add that another one of our members, Iberdrola, used only 2 employees to go and electrify a refugee camp in Ethiopia. So we look at disasters in terms of humanitarian as well as natural disasters. So with 2 employees, they were able to electrify a refugee camp, providing much needed safety for the women and children there, and also convenience. But additionally, they taught local individuals how to do the same and how to maintain it. So they created a lot of impact with 2 dedicated employee volunteers.
What you've mentioned, it makes me jump to another question that we had further along, which is partnerships, because a company right now, they can't do anything on their own, either identify the needs that a community may have or act on their own. So because partnerships are crucial for employee volunteering, especially in disaster-related volunteering, what kind of partnerships, in your experience, are best to implement a disaster-related corporate volunteering program or project? Or is there a difference maybe that you've seen in other disasters like an earthquake or a flooding and COVID-19, which is, when we talked about COVID-19 at the start of it, many months ago, a few of my colleagues and I, we were talking about disaster-related employee volunteering and disaster-related everything in general. And what we identified is that with an earthquake, you have the actual event, and then that's it. Like, it lasts like 10 minutes, an earthquake, maybe, probably even less. But with COVID-19, it's an emergency that doesn't kind of stop. So that makes the challenges even more difficult. So in that sense, do you see that partnerships are crucial? Which kind of partnerships? And is there a difference right now than in other kind of disasters?
Right, right. Well, with partnerships in natural disasters, it's important to have that partnership ahead of time, because obviously in the midst of a disaster, the last thing a nonprofit or an NGO can do is stop and create volunteer opportunities for you. So that is number one on partnerships. But with a COVID type of disaster, it's evolving. There's so much that isn't known, which is similar to a natural disaster, but there's so much that isn't known, and it goes on and on and on. So I would say, again, it helps to start with existing partners. The companies that we work with have lots of different partnerships. But to have what we find in partnerships works best is to have honest conversations about what is needed. The power imbalance can be quite extreme between a corporation that has many assets and revenues and employees and locations and a nonprofit organization. So it's important to have very, very honest conversations and assess what is needed. And also what we find up front is to look at what impact we want to have and discuss what that can be, what that should be, and to reevaluate on an ongoing basis what should happen. So essentially what we're seeing is that companies are looking around and saying, okay, what do I have? What can I contribute? We've seen, for example, perfume manufacturers in France repurposing their factories to create hand sanitizer. So lots of repurposing, lots of creativity. One thing I've noticed, companies and NGOs are doing hackathons or idea generation. We saw this with one of our members, Airbus. They have an ongoing innovation lab where employees meet with their partners and just talk about what they can do, what they can help with. So a lot of exchange of ideas on an ongoing basis with nonprofits is what's helping right now, saying, where can we be helpful, and constantly talking, constantly reevaluating what's possible.
And a lot of, even if this disaster is so much different than a natural one, the 3 steps that you've mentioned, I think there are like many more. It's kind of like 8 steps in disaster risk management, but right. Preparedness, response, and recovery, we're not so far ahead from that. And even if a company wants to start a new project or wants to actually, even if it's a digital one or online one, they do have to prepare. So as a corporate volunteer manager in these uncertain times, a lot of corporate volunteer managers are, because these are uncertain times, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of, because they don't understand what can be their impact, or if they can put in risk their volunteers, which they shouldn't. So they have to think these innovative ways to actually engage with communities. So what should I now be aware of if I'm an employee manager volunteer? So what should I be aware of when designing and implementing a project right now?
Great question, Mariana. I would say, first of all, you have to think about the mental and physical health of your employees. So this disaster has been unique in that I would say nearly every country in the world has been affected. And there is both a health crisis, an economic crisis, on top of that, some natural disasters, some unrest. So a lot is going on. And most employees, I think, worldwide are still at home. So they're juggling, their family's health, childcare needs. So I think that's number one, to think about the needs of your employees. So you may have had an employee who was an enthusiastic volunteer pre-COVID, and they just can't deal with it now. And you have other employees who may have more ability to do their work and also volunteer. So I'd say number one, think about your employee population. Secondly, I would think about the relationship you have again with your NGO. Now is not the time to ask them to unveil a big volunteer program. I think a lot of NGOs are probably right now in the hunt for cash or looking for how to keep their operations going. So to be sensitive to that as well. there's one you already have a good relationship with, that's something that you can build on. Third, I think if you are creating a virtual program, it's important to be aware that many employees got excited about volunteering because they were doing hands-on delivery of volunteering. They had that, that feeling of helping somebody that they could see. So you have to be aware that that's not going to happen in most cases, and think about how to position the volunteer opportunity to show the benefit that you're creating. So I think it's more important than ever to show what benefit that volunteering will, who will benefit from that actual volunteering, and why it's helpful. And then fourthly, I would say, Mariana, that you want to look at tapping those volunteers, as I mentioned in the US Bank example, who have never volunteered before. Tap your executives or tap those who've sat on the sidelines before, and see if they might be interested in volunteering with a new virtual platform. That opens up a lot of new possibilities for employees. So I'd say those are the 4 things to think about.
That's great. I've written them all down, and I think that you have a very interesting point. And you've mentioned something that none of our other experts have mentioned, which I think is very valuable, and it's the mental health of employees. Because a lot of the times, and when we're thinking about employee volunteering during these times, a lot of our employee volunteers might be the ones affected, either them or their families. So it's important that when we create an opportunity for them to engage in an employee volunteering program, that they are protected as well, and that they have the means to actually thrive in whatever they do. That's first. Second, to show, well, the third one, to show the benefit that we're creating. We talked with Chris Jarvis a few days ago, and he mentions that it's important. There's a lot of 2 drivers for employee volunteering. First, to know the person that we're doing volunteering with, and then know why we're doing it. So what you've mentioned kind of aligns with that. And I think it is a challenge, but it's not impossible for managers to actually maintain that connection and keep volunteers engaged and know who they're helping. For example, in Latin America, we have a lot of connectivity barriers, and a lot of the times people can't even have a Zoom call like we're in it right now. So that makes it even a further stretch, because that means that people can barely speak on the phone. So for an employee volunteering program, that might be a challenge, but there are innovative and creative ways for employees to do that. For example, I've seen a lot of cases where managers, instead of, for example, to sensibilize communities, instead of just having a volunteer talk on the phone all day with a vulnerable person, they can actually tell a story, or they can actually have dynamics. And there are very innovative ways for them to engage. So I've seen a lot of creativity there. Finally, tap those who haven't. And in that sense, I wanted to ask you, what are the best tools or strategies to mobilize volunteers in your companies right now? Like, how do we build an inviting environment for increasing participation?
Well, I would say, first of all, to educate employees on what the needs are. So depending on what you are suggesting that be done. For example, my town, hunger is definitely an issue. So many people have lost their job, and some of the local food pantries have arranged for people to be able to go in and organize and pack food, but to be socially distant, they do it without other people around. So in that case, it might be important to educate your potential volunteers about the issue of hunger. How many people are hungry? How many people don't have jobs? So I'd say number 1, educate on the issue. 2, I think what helps in normal times and now as well is to have ambassadors or champions or guides. Companies call them different things. Those who come up with opportunities, who advocate, even when employees are distant, that person could reach out to their work group or people in their country or their city and say, hey, let's volunteer, look, we're gonna do this and this is why. So I think champions are important now as they are in normal times as well. I would say also to list the opportunities on the intranet if connectivity is there. These are the opportunities, push them out to employees. They're probably, if they do have connectivity, on their computers all day, so they can see these are the volunteer opportunities that are available. This is why we're doing it. Again, what I've seen is very helpful to get volunteers excited and engaged is to have short little videos, again, on the company intranet showing the volunteer opportunity, maybe an interview with a volunteer, like 30 seconds, 45 seconds. This is what I did. This is how I felt. This is who it helped. I think that visual connection is helpful. And finally, I think recognition is important for volunteers. Right now, IAVE is doing a big corporate volunteering research project, and I'm struck by how recognition is very culturally diverse. So you probably know that there's cultures that recognition is actually shunned, and I'm surprised by how many cultures shun recognition. It's like you volunteer because you do it, not for recognition. So in those cases, there's something called dollars for doers, that if an employee volunteers, then that organization gets a grant from the company based on those volunteer hours. So that's one way. But in other cultures, some kind of recognition, the CEO sends out something, a certificate, a shout out in a meeting. So I would say some form of recognition is a way to encourage more volunteering, both now and later on an ongoing basis. So those are some tools for getting your employees excited about volunteering.
That's great. You've mentioned a lot of education, which comes with empathy, ambassadors and champions. That means that we can also, it's not just the employee volunteering manager jumping up and down and saying, hey, come join me, but it's actually everyone around you. So you create little allies in your company, so they can also be an advocate for your employee volunteering strategy, which is very cool. And the visual connection and recognition, among other things. So that's very, very helpful. So I wanted to ask you how, right now, you've seen a lot of innovation and you've seen how everyone's adapting their employee volunteering strategies with the partners that they already have, and some of them haven't shut down their programs entirely. They've just like try to change them. So what are the opportunities you see for that innovation right now? And what are the challenges? How can we start innovating?
I would say the opportunity is that there's tremendous need, right? First of all. So I would say look around, see what's needed in your community, the countries where you're active. What we've seen, for example, that there's a lot of economic hardship, a lot of people have lost their jobs. Some of the companies we know have done mentoring for young people to look at their resumes, to help them do practice interviews, to get jobs, and to mentor them through the job search process. So I would say, look around, see what's needed in your community, look at what assets your company has in terms of physical assets, in terms of employee skills, and think creatively about how you can do that. I'd say the challenge is that there's chaos. I mean, there's honestly, maybe I don't need to say it, there's chaos all around. So what you try now may not be sustainable later. You may choose to do things now that you won't do post-COVID. But I'd say almost that you just have to ride the wave. I mean, day to day, we learn new things, and it's really a challenge to be flexible. It's testing our flexibility, but I think I'm seeing a lot of hopeful examples. So be flexible and look around and keep talking.
That's something, you've mentioned something that I find very, very valuable and a very important tool, which is how can companies analyze the tools that they have at their disposal that are very much needed. For example, if we talk about how to get a job or resumes or interviews, or a lot of people, we have like 40% unemployment here right now in Peru. So it's the crisis, the economic ones or the effects in terms of labor are also very high. So no one is better at companies than companies. So that's why they can actually put their employees' talents and skills to that. So that's a very interesting way to approach it and to try to innovate and maybe get closer to the core business. So finally, I wanted to ask you, why do you think it's important and valuable for companies to work with each other in platforms such as Inspiring Companies and Clave, where they have learning spaces or promote joint actions? Is there any benefit for companies that you've seen?
Well, Marianne, I'd say there's a huge benefit because problems aren't solved in a silo. And I would say that CSR and corporate volunteering, corporate social responsibility and corporate volunteering really lend themselves to collaboration and sharing. It's not like you have intellectual property that you're protecting. I mean, conversation is a good thing and collaboration is a good thing. Clave, which my colleague Raida Mana manages, and you know her well, she does a fantastic job. Yes. And great conversations. And the Global Corporate Volunteer Council that I facilitate has members from 5 different continents, and we look at the global issues. But in both cases, what we do is we share ideas, we share inspiring practices, we share challenges, and we do it normally in person and virtually, and now more virtually. But we also share in between. So it gives a cross-industry perspective on how volunteering can be better. And what we're also seeing is that in some instances, there's collaboration on volunteer projects between companies. Now, this is harder to do because of different cultures, company cultures, national cultures. It's hard. It's really hard to meld those cultures, but I have seen some great success. And I think it's worth continuing the conversation and continuing to try to do some collaborative work. I know the Clave companies have done some really interesting collaboration. And the thing is that people who have chosen this work have done it because they want to see impact. They want to see results. And I think there's no shortage of challenges, and we should just continue to try to collaborate and meet these challenges.
Yes, it's worked very well with Clave. And here in Peru, we also have a network called Empresas que Inspiran, or Inspiring Companies, which is a very similar thing, but at a national level, which is kind of easier because it also allows us to do a lot of joint actions and investigations and promote knowledge and joint spaces for learning. So that's something that we've seen that works very well with the private sector here. And I invite more companies to join these kind of networks and to also see how to implement them around the world, because it would be so cool if we had one of those in every country and that we could connect with and do things maybe even at a global scale, right? So that would be a dream. So we have some questions from people here. I'm gonna read them to you. We have a lot of questions. The first one comes from Pedro Parks. He asks, what are good mechanisms to convince the board of directors to participate in volunteering activities?
So senior level involvement. I would say, according to the example that I mentioned, that if you look at their unique skills and you convince them that they have skills, unique skills that are now in demand, like their financial acumen, their executive presence, could be very helpful for NGOs right now. And I think there's another way to convince them, I've seen, is to show that their leadership by example will marshal that many more employees. And I would say to take pictures of them volunteering, to promote what they're doing, and tell them that that creates goodwill among the employees as well as in the communities. So I'd appeal to their leadership, and that's what I would try.
That's great. We have a few more questions. The second one is also from Pedro. He asks, what is the best way to build a strong narrative for volunteering in times of crisis?
Strong narrative. Again, I would say if you talk about the volunteering that you're doing and the challenge, or perhaps even the sustainable development goal that you are working to try to alleviate. Many of our companies select 2, 3, 4 goals, and they gear their volunteer programs around them. And that has been a great way to focus employees and say, look, we are trying to alleviate poverty, and this is how we're working on it. We are working on gender equity, and this is the program that promotes that. So I would say that can build a narrative, and other activities that you do to again put them on the internet, explain why you're doing it, and also to show the impact of what you're doing. Some companies will interview the beneficiaries of their programs and put that up, and that builds a very strong narrative.
That's amazing. One of the things you mentioned I like a lot, which is because I'm UNDP, so connecting to the SDGs, I've found out with companies that that's a great way to kind of engage with volunteers and build a strong narrative, because you're telling them that they're working towards something better and something greater than themselves and to their country at a national scale. So that's a very interesting thing to aim towards. Another question we have is from Juan. He asks, what are key factors in educating a volunteer for crisis times versus regular times?
I think in crisis times, it would be similar in that you would let them know what problem you're trying to solve for. For example, the company that was working with the isolated elderly, perhaps explain, it may not be obvious to everybody, that they can't have visitors, they can't see their family, that the elderly get particularly lonely. So explain the facts that are leading up to what you are trying to volunteer to correct. Education for volunteers, why they're doing it. So they're not just mindlessly volunteering. They're volunteering to make something better. And then to show follow-up. Okay, so we've done 4 months of contacting the elderly, and they report that they feel more cheered, they're eating better, they're happier. So I think, again, education up front, making the case, and then follow up to show the impact of the volunteering. Again, in times of crisis as well as in normal times.
That's great. We have another one by Yolanda Gutierrez. She asks, what is the biggest role of research in face of what this new reality is going to bring?
Could she explain a little bit more about what kind of research?
Yes, maybe Yolanda, you can tell us a little bit about that. I think it's how can research maybe help us? I'm maybe taking a leap here. You can correct me, Yolanda, if I'm wrong, but how can research help us build better strategies right now? And how can that information actually impact what we do?
Okay. I would say that I'm going to take it in the context of knowing what other companies are doing, which speaks to the networks that we have. Benchmarking is very important. For example, our GCVC members, IAVE members, would talk once or twice a month and say, okay, how are you addressing this crisis? What kind of volunteering have you been doing? So that's, benchmarking is a form of research. What are others doing? For example, and then we would highlight what they were doing. Members would say, well, how are you helping? What employee assistance programs do you have? So we did some research and posted for all of them. This is what this particular company is doing in terms of employee assistance. So research in terms of benchmarking what others are doing, which will give you ideas, which can short circuit the process. We are also now doing research on what looks like we're going to be interviewing about between 60 and 70 companies, how they are managing their employee volunteer programs overall, but we're also looking at how they have responded to the pandemic. So, and how they've adjusted their programs. So we've asked them in the spring what they're doing, and our intent is to go back to them in December and say, okay, what did you keep? What did you discard? So we will be publishing that research on how employee volunteer programs have responded to COVID from the outset, and then say 6, 7, 8 months later. And I think research, is useful so you don't have to reinvent your program and ideas as a volunteer manager.
Right. I skipped a question from Juan. I'm going to ask you to answer it now. What are the main skills to be reinforced considering the needs are different, being natural disasters or pandemic?
The skills to be reinforced?
Reinforced right now. What are the skills that employee volunteers need right now to develop?
I would say volunteer skills. Well, everyone brings, their own different skills.
Right.
But I would say, let's say if they are mentoring, there's a lot of mentoring, and I should say that IAVE in 2016 held a one-day forum in Berlin on how corporate volunteers can help refugees when they had the huge influx of refugees in Europe. And a lot of the volunteering was mentoring. So helping refugees acclimate to their new country, helping them with language skills. So I mentioned earlier mentoring to help youth and others get jobs. So if you're a mentor volunteer, I would say listening, empathy and listening would be very important. I would say depending on what problem you're trying to solve. So one of our members, Google, worked in the wake of the earthquakes in Nepal, and they were working on designing an app that would help families find each other, a people finder app. So in that case, they were testing their technology and app development skills. I would say whatever skills you bring to your volunteering effort, you will be in the process of volunteering, expanding those skills by using it in a new context. So whatever you do in business, you're expanding them by being a volunteer. But I think if we bring empathy and listening skills, that's overall good advice for a volunteer in times of crisis.
We have another question from Yolanda. She asks, should the corporate sector get involved in academic research? Is it valuable to do it in situ? Or would it be better to join or support existing initiatives in terms of cost efficiency?
In terms of joining academic research, I think, so the research that we're doing, we are consulting NGOs, academics, the UN, and beneficiaries. So I think in research, the broader look you have, the better, right? Because you have different perspectives. There's the theoretical, and then there's the practical. And personally, I think a combination is ideal. And also, yes, definitely drawing on research that has taken place before, that exists.
Perfect. We have another question by Silvia Nakache de Sao Paulo, Brazil. She asks, Lorrie and Mariana, congrats, a very special and inspired interview. Do you know cases of corporate volunteer programs that are now using gamification strategies?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear. What kind of strategies?
Gamification strategies.
Oh, yes. I know of companies that are talking about doing it, but I don't know ones that have actually implemented, but many are talking about doing gamification, yes. So I don't have a good example for you yet, maybe in a few months.
Hopefully. Melissa Campo asks, what to keep in mind to mobilize executive managers for volunteering if they are almost never interested in participating?
Okay. So what I've seen, one way well, there are a few ways to get executives involved. I would start with the issue, explain the issue and what you're volunteering to help. So as you said, in Peru, unemployment is at 40%, huge issue. It would be hard, I think, it would be a cold-hearted executive who would say, I think that we have the skills to help here, and we should be volunteering to mentor individuals to help them find jobs. So I would say first start with the issue, appeal to them on the issue to get interested and supportive. Secondly, there is a lot of evidence that shows that employees who volunteer through their company feel better about their company. There's a lot of research that shows they feel more engaged as employees, they feel better about the brand. And then if that doesn't work, I would say that there is a lot of positive brand affiliation with corporate volunteers, that consumers feel better about a company that is socially involved. So I would try those three strategies: the issue, the employee retention and satisfaction, and then the branding, thirdly.
I think a lot of it has to do with the kind of measurement. I mean, I know it's still a challenge for everyone, but I think it's very, it can be an opportunity to create better indicators, maybe associate them with SDGs, maybe try to look past numbers. And, you know, a lot of companies do like a kind of a skills exam, like at the beginning, at the end, with interviews and other strategies, so they can actually show the company or the leaders or the volunteer managers how volunteering can impact the company itself. So that can also be a very good tool to convince people to actually do it. Increases productivity, maybe the culture, the organizational culture, or the climate. That can also be a good argument.
Yes, and I would say also on that point, Mariana, you made me think of something else, is that the companies that we work with that have cross-border volunteer programs where they send a team to another country, that's maybe more typical in a pharmaceutical or a technical industry, that the employees learn more about that country, they learn about teamwork in uncertainty, and they also learn maybe how their product or service is viewed, and then come back with product and service modifications. So that would be a fourth benefit that I think executives would pay attention to.
Amazing. We have another question. Someone asks, what are the key factors to make valuable partnerships with companies?
I would say key factors are setting down, so I'm assuming the partnerships between NGO and companies, or between companies and companies?
Maybe both.
Maybe both, okay. So both, I would say, to decide up front what you want to achieve, be very clear about what you want to achieve and how you plan to measure it. Be clear about who is going to do what in any partnership. I think it's important to be clear, this is what we're going to do, how often we're going to evaluate it, and to, again, have honest conversations. One of the things we do in every Global Corporate Volunteer Council meeting is we say, talk about a partnership that works well, talk about one that doesn't work so well. So we have very honest conversations about that. And then we take it apart and say, why did this one work and why didn't this one work? And in every case I've seen, it's conversation, objectives up front, honesty, and very often have check-ins. And also, I would say too, when you have a project, when it's over, to do what I call an after-action review. Again, honest conversation, what worked well, what didn't work so well, what would we do differently? And then also I would say an exit strategy. When you have a partnership and you've either met the goals or haven't met the goals, what is your decision point for leaving that partnership? So one company that we work with had a 15-year partnership with a blind organization. And they did a huge report analyzing the whole partnership, and they felt that they did everything that they could, and it was time for them to move on. So exit strategy would be important also.
Perfect. We have a question from Marco Davila. He raised his hand, so I'm gonna allow him to talk if he wants to.
Great.
Marco?
Hola.
Hola, Marco.
Hola.
¿Querías hacer una pregunta?
No, ninguna. Estaba escuchando atentamente. Gracias.
Perfecto. Muchas gracias. We have a question in Spanish. I'm going to translate it for you. How can employee volunteering generate value for a company specifically, given that companies in one way or another have a main goal of generation of benefit for themselves?
I would say the value to a company of employee volunteering, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of literature that says employees are more engaged if there's a volunteer program, only if, the average is between, I'd say 18 and 25% of employees volunteering in companies where it's not mandatory. Some companies in Asia, it's kind of expected that you volunteer, so not counting them, 18 to 25%. And there's a lot that says that helps retain and attract employees, so that's a benefit. Also, I think increasingly, consumers are looking to companies to do well in some ways, whether it's in grant making or in volunteering in the community. So it's brand building. And thirdly, also what I mentioned, you have a chance when you're out in the community to test ideas and concepts in terms of, does this product resonate with the community, depending on the product. So there's a lot of benefits to companies volunteering. I mentioned before. Does that answer the question?
Yes, I think it does. We're close to the end. Oh, but we have one more question. Perfect. Out of curiosity, where in the world do you think volunteering has reinvented itself more rapidly nowadays regarding to COVID-19? That's a great question.
It's a fabulous question. That's a fabulous question. Where in the world? Honestly, I've seen it pretty uniformly because our companies are everywhere. And it's taken different forms. I'd say in the US and Europe, there's been a lot of virtual volunteering that they've switched to that pretty quickly. I think in Africa, they have still done some hands-on volunteering. Cases, fortunately, have not been as strong. There's been some hands-on volunteering. In India, they've reported some hands-on volunteering as well. But I've seen innovation all over. One company that had a volunteer project, they called it a volunteer power hour, which they had never done before. So completely virtual in 45 different countries. So employees took 1 hour at the same time, the same day, not the same time, the same day around the world, 45 countries. And they employees select 5 different virtual opportunities. And it was so successful. Employees were really excited about it. They had employees who had never volunteered before. So they're planning to do another volunteer power hour in September. So I would say this cut across 45 different countries. There's actually innovation everywhere.
That's amazing. I'm sure we'll be able to send all the participants a lot of links that you'll be able to provide us with experiences like this. You've mentioned a lot of interesting cases and examples of ways that countries and employee volunteering managers are innovating, even globally. So that's amazing, the power that has. So I wanted to ask you one last question. If there's no other questions with the audience, I think we're done. So I wanted to ask you, this is a more soft question, but I wanted to ask you if you had, right now, what the people that are watching us are a lot of employee volunteer managers or volunteers themselves maybe, or social organizations. So if you had some words of wisdom or some advice or message of hope that you wanted to share with all the employee volunteers managers that are probably racketing their heads to see how they can adapt their programs, what would you tell them?
Oh, great question. I would say that it's a chaotic time and that the world needs volunteers more than ever. One of our researchers on our project is in Beirut, Lebanon, which many have heard just had a complete disaster. And my colleague sent me an article describing how volunteers went, without being organized, went into people's homes and cleaned out the glass and the shattered glass. And then just armies of volunteers without organization just went in and did that, which to me is so moving and speaks to the power of volunteering. So I think my message is, in good times and in bad, volunteers are front and center, making the world a better place. And that's why I'm excited to do this work. And I applaud all the volunteers and volunteer managers listening, and keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you so much, Lorrie. That's amazing what volunteers are doing right now around the world. So I wanted to thank you for the hour that you've given us, a lot of interesting topics, and I'm sure we'll be able to send every article and link that you've mentioned today with the attendees. They've been very, very excited to speak with you, as have I. So thank you so much, Lorrie. Thank you to everyone. Muchísimas gracias por participar. Les estaremos enviando el video y todos los links que nos comparta Lorrie. Así que thank you so much.
Gracias.